Hello and welcome to this event today. My name is Chris Pratt. I'm Managing Director of Hill & Knowlton's Better Impact, Sustainability and Social Impact consulting business, and I'm delighted to be joined today by an expert panel talking about a really important topic ahead of the UN Environment Assembly gathering in Nairobi later this month. That is specifically to talk about whether we need a UN treaty in order to address the issue of plastic pollution. And I'm going to hand over now to our moderator, James Murray from Business Green, who is going to introduce the panel and take us through the event.
Excellent. Thanks, Chris, and thanks to H&K for coordinating today's discussion, which, as you say, promises to be a fascinating and very timely hour or so, talking about this critical question of whether we need a Paris Agreement for plastics, if you will, a new international treaty to tackle the escalating plastics crisis. As I'm sure many of the viewers here today will be aware, that the data is absolutely terrifying on this front. We ran a story only yesterday on Business Green from a new report on the scale of the plastics crisis. I mean, production's doubled in the last 20 years. Waste levels have similarly doubled, and even the most mature economies are really struggling to get a grip on this, let alone the challenge faced by developing economies where there isn't any sort of recycling infrastructure to tackle this crisis. And as we all know, this plastic is produced in ways that result in significant carbon emissions, the impacts on human health, on natural environments, and many other functions are severe, and there are better alternatives. We are starting to see new approaches develop that should allow us to curb or turn this tide of plastic waste, which poses the question, how do we roll them out quicker? And one option is obviously some form of international agreement that ensures that you remove free riders and ensure that everyone's moving in lockstep in this hopefully more progressive direction. That's the very, very, very quick elevator pitch of some of the issues we're going to be discussing over the next hour or so, and we've got a fantastic lineup of speakers and experts to explore this topic with us. I'm delighted to be joined by Carsten Wackels, who is from the Ellen MacArthur Foundation. Christina Niemela-Strom is from IKEA. David Clark is from Amcor, and Christian Hughes is at the WEF's Global Plastic Action Partnership Programme. So as I say, a really expert panel who'll be offering their views in the next hour. Before we get underway, this is an interactive webinar. I understand we've got well over 100 people registered, so please do put your comments in the chat function. And more pertinently, if you have any questions for the panel, please use the Q&A function, not the chat function, because it makes my life a lot easier not having to keep track of two things from what looks like my nuclear bunker here in central London. I can assure you it's not. It is a TV studio, just the lights aren't fully on. So there we go. Excellent. So, well, let's get underway then. I'm going to start with Carsten, and who obviously with the Ellen MacArthur Foundation has been one of the key organisations leading this campaign for an international treaty, which, as I understand it, has support from nearly 100 countries now and is gaining quite significant momentum ahead of next week's important summit in Nairobi. Carsten, can you just give us a quick overview of what the current lay of the land is on this campaign, the case for the treaty, and what your hopes are for next week's big meeting?
Thanks, James, for the introduction, and happy to set a bit the scene for this hour of discussion and exchanges. So the big summit is called the United Nations Environmental Assembly. It meets normally every second year. And since 2014, they have actually discussed plastic pollution at each of their sessions 4 times. And the conclusion was always, we need to improve international coordination and cooperation to address plastic pollution globally and at scale. So where do we stand today with these efforts? Around 1/3 of all plastic-related regulations around the world address bans or taxes on plastic bags. Another third deals with beverage packaging, that is mainly about single-use plastic bottles, and 1/3 with all the rest, with a particular focus on improving waste management efforts. It is pretty obvious that current policies are not yet matching with the magnitude of the challenge. As you already pointed out, global plastic production and consumption volumes have not been only increased in the past, they are also projected to further increase sharply in the coming decades. And at the same time, plastic pollution increasingly contributes to the climate and biodiversity crisis. So the cost of inaction increases basically year by year due to negative health, social, and also economic impacts. Despite current efforts to reduce plastic leakage into the environment, we would still have 4 times more plastics in the ocean in 2040 than today, summing up to a stunning 600 million tons. Governments, industry, and civil society will have to work together towards a common understanding not only of the root causes of the problem, but also agree on a shared approach to address it. And for us at the Ellen MacArthur Foundation, a global treaty should build on a circular economy for plastics, addressing its entire life cycle based on 3 generic principles. First of all, we need to eliminate all problematic and unnecessary plastic items that we do not need. We need to innovate to ensure that the plastics that we do need are either reusable, recyclable, or compostable. And finally, circulate all plastic items we use to keep them in the economy and out of the environment. A legally binding UN treaty to address plastic pollution will amplify existing voluntary initiatives and create a level playing field for an industry that operates along global value chains. And an international agreement must provide a robust governance structure to ensure that all countries can participate and finally comply with the targets that they have been set. In our work, with many of you also on the panel, we have to acknowledge the important role of common definitions as well as harmonized standards that can be applicable to all. This increases policy alignment, consistency, and effectiveness, and hopefully helps facilitating investments, the necessary investments to scale innovations, infrastructure, and skills in the countries and industries most in need of international support. That's basically the challenge where I think not just 100 countries, I think in principle, we are something like between 150, 180, probably you say in principle, we want this. It's just a question, how do we get started and how do we organize the process of negotiating a new multilateral environmental agreement? And that's what is already ongoing in Nairobi this week to prepare for the meeting done next week. To agree on a negotiation mandate. I leave it there and I'm happy to jump in later in the discussion.
Cool. Just before we open up to the rest of the panel question, just a quick question for you. I mean, what, in a nutshell, why do you think a treaty is needed? Why is the voluntary approach not sufficient? And obviously, you know, plastics do go across borders and the like, but it's not as sort of as big a kind of free rider challenge as the climate is, where you can very clearly make the case for why we need an international treaty. What's your pitch for why this is needed and why this isn't just another treaty that just creates more work for people and doesn't necessarily get a result?
Sure. I mean, we have been mostly engaging with the packaging value chain. We have gathered around 20% of the global plastics packaging market, many leading companies who are committed to work towards common goals. And still we feel that if we don't bring the other 80% of the market alongside with us, we will not achieve circularity in practice. And for that, we need to have common rules. And they need to be set, I mean, they need to be discussed between the public and the private sector, but to create that harmonized effort towards the circular economy for plastics, regulations are needed. And the international framework or the international agreement will not set everything at the global level, but it enables governments to put together more meaningful and more effective regulations than what we see in the world today. I think that's the main trigger about it. We all agree there's not only plastic pollution, there may be a general question how we manage our resources in the world economy of today. But if we get it for plastic right, we probably can learn much more how we handle also other issues regarding natural resources management.
Yeah, absolutely. Let's bring in, you mentioned the businesses there and working with businesses. Let's bring in one of them, Christina from IKEA. I mean, what's your take as somebody who works in business as to why this is necessary, and you know, you work for a company that's done a lot of voluntary stuff on this front. Why do you feel the need for that international treaty, hopefully from next week?
Yeah, I mean, we can just look where we are today. And what we have done in the past, the initiatives or maybe lack of initiatives has brought us where we are. So I think that definitely we need to do something different. And as what Carsten is saying, it's a global dilemma, so we need to have a global solution. So I think also for IKEA, we are global, both retailer and with a global supply chain. So we are already today working with global standards and try to implement that also in areas and countries where maybe there isn't legislations available. So we're working with that. So this treaty would further help us to be better in what should we do, what do we not do, and create this much needed level playing field so that we are many companies and the governments, etc., driving in the same direction. Because I think it's only when we do it together that we can make this really, really work and harvest the learning and the experience from each other. So we don't all need to go through the same pains to get to the gains.
And what would you see happening from here? I mean, what's the sort of timelines for a treaty, and what practical impact would it have on your business and your business decision making?
I think that from the business decision making, we have already decided that we want to be and we need to be a circular business by 2030. But of course, we cannot be a circular business in a linear world. So we need to get this circular society with all of us involved in that. So I think for us, if we are more that are onto this journey, it will enable our already set ambitions where we are taking steps. We have already banned, for instance, single-use plastic. We have said that by 2030 we should only aim for 100% renewable recycled materials. So also the recycled amounts will be needed, because the future for our plastic products tomorrow, that should come from recycled feedstock. So we need to work with that and be there, where the dilemmas are. This will not be easy. We need to be in those the informal waste setups to work with them, transform them. Also, here comes a very important question, I think, with the human rights and the livelihoods. We talk so much about the just transition, and with those increased, I mean, it's not only IKEA who will go recycled, it's all of us who need to do that. So I think by working together, we can get to that movement faster. And as I said, also be a little bit more efficient with our resources. And us as IKEA, we need those materials. Then, of course, as a company with a full value chain approach, we can work both upstream and downstream. I don't think this question is only about recycled plastic. We need to go to the source, and we need to work with all the different parts in the life cycle of plastics materials.
Yeah, absolutely. I'll bring in David Clark here from Amcor, a different part of the chain here. David, for those who don't know, just give us a quick précis. Who are Amcor? And then similar question to you. I mean, what would you hope to see from a treaty, and what kind of impact would you expect it to have?
Yeah, thanks, James, and hi, everyone. Amcor is a company that makes packaging for consumer packaged goods. So we make the packages that your food and beverages, medicine, home and personal care products would come in, the things you see in the grocery store and have in your pantries and medicine cabinets today. And I can tell you that, over the years, plastics have become the material of choice for many packages because they're very resource efficient. They are incredibly low carbon footprint compared to many of the alternatives. But the downside is we haven't had the infrastructures in place to create circular economies, whether that's recycling or reuse or composting in some cases. We operate in 40 countries around the world, not only with plastics, but with paper, metals, and other materials. And I can tell you, in every country that does have a good circular solution, whether it's recycling or reuse or others, there are two things. There's sound government policy, and there's a funding mechanism, because all of these cost more than the materials are worth that come back. And the only way that will happen is if we have government involvement and government support in a framework. And that's one of the reasons that the harmonized solutions that we've been talking about are we think, so important to be able to enable the type of lifestyles and the products that we're buying, and make sure that we can do that in an environmentally responsible way. We can get those materials back again, keep them in the economy, and increase the amount of recycled content that we use.
And so if circularity is the end goal here, I mean, what practically would you need a treaty to have in it? What are the policy measures that do tend to work? Because, as I say, no country yet's doing this brilliantly. This is the problem. I think
that there are pockets where places are doing it with certain materials. I mean, certainly PET bottle recycling rates in many countries around the world are up at 90% plus, and we see brands now introducing 100% recycled content packages into those markets. So, I think we can learn from those. You know, what we essentially need is we need sound waste management infrastructure, and that's a social issue in many parts of the world, not just around plastics. But I can tell you from doing beach cleanups in you know, many developing parts of the world, it's not only plastic on the beaches. It's clothing, it's food waste, it's sanitary products, shoes. You know, everything you can think of is being discarded because there's no sound waste management. So providing that infrastructure and encouraging governments and enabling governments to provide what we consider here to be a basic, you know, right and way of living, I think is absolutely mandatory. Standardization across countries around what is considered recyclable and what's not would make it much easier for international companies to operate from one country to another. If there are funding mechanisms to help developing countries put these systems in place, you know, and innovate for new solutions, I think those are all things that we'd like to see. And if we want to track progress, then the data is really important. And right now, it's really difficult to tell in many parts of the world how much material is actually being recycled, how much is being leaked, how much is being incinerated. So better data to help us drive decision making is another element of the treaty that we'd really like to see.
Yeah, absolutely. No, Kristen, I'll bring you in here. Again, for those who might not know, what is the Global Plastic Action Partnership Program? And then I just want to maybe again ask you to unpack a little bit what this treaty should entail, and what you think are the sort of key points here that could drive real progress.
Thank you, James, and thanks also to H&K for hosting us this afternoon. Important discussion. I appreciate the question. The Global Plastic Action Partnership and our partners, including UNAP, WWF, EMF, Kirsten, and many others, are increasingly supporting efforts to coordinate and implement plastic action at the national level. So really drilling in at a country by country, national and subnational level, really to try to help assist these countries to understand what the plastic waste flows are and where they can work to try to address them. And so much like the question you asked, Kirsten, plastic pollution is actually a global problem that needs global solutions with harmonized approaches and ways to measure for progress, so that we're actually seeing this harmonized apples to apples, oranges to oranges. And so when you think about the world's governments getting together next week at UNEA, on top of the agenda will be this global treaty. And you think about climate change and the Paris Agreement, well, it's allowed companies, it's allowed governments, and it's allowed others to really set ambitious targets towards net zero greenhouse gas emissions. Currently, all governments are setting very different kinds of targets on plastic pollution, and they're not really talking to one another. So the treaty would certainly allow for binding approaches to commitments, help the governments and others to take tangible action, will help to track progress against those commitments, and hopefully help the world to actually get on course towards a zero plastic pollution, much like Paris is towards net zero on climate. So we're really hoping that something along the lines of the global treaty would set out rules for production, use, disposal. Kirsten also mentioned, James mentioned the collection and recycling and use of plastics downstream. So very much you see this idea growing from support for businesses, from governments, because there really is a big need to harmonize and approach both upstream and downstream for what is truly a global epidemic.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm going to do the typical journalist thing here and play a bit of devil's advocate for you. I mean, both yourself and David, and I think the others probably all agree with this, set out some of the key things that are needed. You know, you need better data, more standardized reporting, standardized rules across borders, and obviously the big question of infrastructure, recycling infrastructure funding, particularly in developing economies, but you know, it's not perfect in industrialized economies either. It maps very clearly onto what was needed in many ways is needed with the Paris Agreement. Similar challenges of funding flows into developing countries, into getting countries to agree rules that are standardized when they might not feel it's in their national interest to have those. And obviously it will map onto the geopolitical tensions that we've seen mar the climate talks as well, and they're currently more than a little tense around the world. I mean, what do you see as the chances of overcoming some of those challenges and convincing countries to sign up to something that will require that level of cooperation, standardization, and probably most controversially, financial flows to other nations?
Well, it's a fantastic question, and as James mentioned, nobody's really figured it out yet. So it's not like the global north telling the global south what to do. I think there's a huge opportunity for the global north to take lessons on board from the global south. And this is what the treaty can also allow, with that best exchange of the right ideas when we do find them, and ways that then can hopefully bring investments with proper returns on those investments into these countries. And one of the most remarkable things, you see Ghana at the top of the list of the countries who are promoting the treaty. Rwanda created its one of the drafts for the treaty. So these are governments that are very forward thinking and recognizing they've got to bring others on board because it is such a global problem. Ghana can do all they can to support their own infrastructure, but if their neighbors don't actually address this issue as well, that rubbish continues to come on land. Just as James said, it's also not just plastics, but at least let's address this. So I think that you can see that with some of these forward thinkers, IKEA can bring on the laggards in the corporate space, Ghana, Rwanda, others can bring on the laggards from the governments. So hopefully in time, we actually can reach some very ambitious targets, and then together really set out to both track against those targets and put together actions that help us to progress.
Absolutely. Carsten, bring you back in. I mean, the case sounds pretty compelling, and obviously everyone on this panel seems to be in ferocious agreement, as is often the case. I mean, what do you think are the chances of success here, and how do you envisage hopefully overcoming some of those potential barriers that I just sketched out?
Yeah, I mean, whatever will be decided next week in UNEA, we hope that it is the starting point of a journey. And I think that's a bit the difference also compared to the Paris Agreement, which is always cited for climate. I mean, Paris was not the start of the climate negotiations. We had already more than 20 years of international negotiations on the climate debate. And then again, we only set out a very aspirational long-term goal, 1.5 degrees or at least below 2 degrees global warming. And we left all the technicalities, how countries get there, basically to the discretion of national governments. I think if there's one lesson to learn from that approach is we should not repeat that exactly the same way for plastics. It's not enough just to say zero leakage into the environment. Everybody would probably sign up to that. It's really about designing a roadmap for governments to embark on a journey wherever they are currently. So there are basic things we need to fix in terms of major leakage, which costs not only environmental, but also economic problems for those countries. That's much around what David mentioned about ramping up systems for collection and sorting and making it fit into the economic system in different regions of the world. But then it's all about creating incentives. How do we move towards more circularity? And the power of realigning incentives, which are currently incentivizing our linear take, make, waste system, would actually help businesses in those countries to seize new business opportunities. And that's something which balances off a bit the one sector which will be a loser. Gas and oil is not only a loser on climate, they will also be a loser on plastics to some extent, at least compared with the projections that they're currently calculating with. And then there is the let's say, the advanced level. In the end, all scientific analysis in this topic says we need to restrain demand to some extent for plastics. Otherwise, we will never catch up with cleaning up and circulating the plastics we have. And that's where the upstream part and the design part in it. And as other speakers on this panel have pointed out, there's not a single country who figured out that completely. So there is much to gain also for the more advanced industries to introduce more harmonized design standards and other measures to promote the way forward. So the more we present this as a journey, the treaty will not resolve everything from the beginning. It helps government embarking and getting better over time and to mobilize more resources to actually achieve the targets that they have already been subscribed to. That's a bit the thinking about what we need to get clear when they sign off to start that journey, hopefully next week.
And just very, very quickly on this, because there's so much ground to get through and we've got quite a few questions coming in, but just very quickly, I mean, how would you see it being enforced? Because this is one of the big challenges currently with all international treaties is you set this kind of wonderful, utopian vision, but then what do you do if several countries, and you could probably guess who some of them might be, just turn around and go, we're not playing?
I mean, this is the $1 million question. There's hardly any sanctions attached to a multilateral environmental agreement. It's about getting the traction that you have more benefits from being part of the club than being outside. I think with plastic specifically, and we see the same discussions now coming up on climate, not without tensions, but obviously a common interest is that many of those products are traded. They are not domestically produced, domestically consumed, and that's it. We have huge trade flows on plastics, and the more the treaty facilitates trade of those plastic products that can be circulated, rather than creating countries who are importing plastic items that they cannot handle, the more there will be traction to be part defining these rules. Mm-hmm. It's a bit of a new territory because we have so far defined rules for trading of waste. We may see in the 21st century the need to define more rules on what kind of products can be traded. And I think plastics would be a perfect precedent to look into this. How can we facilitate trade rather than blocking it?
Mm, absolutely. Christina, I mean, this brings in the business perspective once again. I mean, one of the defining features of the Paris Agreement, and I think Christiana Figueres has said this, is one of the things that helped get it over the line was really strong business support. Businesses saying, actually, we want this. We want effective regulation. We want carbon pricing. We want all these other things that can help drive forward progress towards net zero. Do you feel that there's similar levels of business support here for this type of treaty? And what can businesses do, maybe people watching today, to kind of help advance this cause?
Of course, I think it depends on which business you're in. If you're in the production of virgin plastics, maybe not. But if you are in other areas like what we have decided that we're going to go to the circular economy, regardless, I would say, of this treaty. But with the treaty, setting the definitions, I think that is in a very, very important part, that we have common definitions, for instance, on labeling, on consumer products, on how to take care of, could be the plastic packaging, if there's still that in the products, but also on the products themselves, so that they go back into the flows, so that companies like IKEA and others can actually use that material that is safe and clean and that is possible to do. And I think that when you asked this question before, that is more macroeconomic question, you know, how will we get also the countries who maybe today don't have the financial ability to do this all by themselves, but they're actually sitting on a resource, which is then the waste. So seeing that as the raw material, of course, as a feedstock, that also actually brings in some financial incentives for them to take it out. And I think here is where, and I think you said that, David, of course, and the waste sectors is just because they are in the northern hemisphere, in the Western world, doesn't mean that it's perfect either. There's still much to do there. But if we say in the more informal sectors, of course, there's a lot of work to do. And there, I think also we as companies, we have a part to play. So we're trying now different explorations with waste companies that are then actually formalizing the collecting and the picking and securing that there is a good livelihood and the pay, etc., and safe working conditions, so that we can get the hand on all those resources that are just lying out there and then get it back into the flow. So I would say that from a business, at least from our side, we see that this is also a business opportunity. And this is, in a way, this is the only way forward. It's like you have to take some decisions. And I can share an example. We decided a few years ago that we're not going to work with virgin polyester anymore. Everything has to come from recycled. And now we are at 90% fulfillment in all of our polyester fabric, for instance. And I'm sure there are many more things we can do better there. But at least we drove that question. So when you decide, you can do it, and you're also driving a change in the society, and others will follow suit.
Yeah, absolutely. That catalyzing effect is what's desperately needed on so many climate related and circular economy related issues. As I said, we've got some fantastic questions coming in, so I'm going to start working through a few of them, I think. David, I'll come to you next, but Nick has posed a question here, and it also relates to another question we've got earlier about the kind of the iniquities in infrastructure. He asked, how might an international treaty recognise the differences between nations in their capability to shift to circular economies for plastics, which is a crucial point. And he also raises another really important issue, which is, you know, would a treaty need to recognise, or presumably it would need to recognise, how many developed countries have a tendency to just export their plastic waste elsewhere, and there's been some absolute scandals on that front. I mean, how do we deal with this kind of the differing levels of development and responsibility here?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and I'd like to believe that the export situation is better now than it was a few years ago. Now that the light's been shown on this, and we see countries like China with their national sword policy saying enough's enough. The reality is we in many countries in the developed world didn't do a very good job of sorting our recyclables, and then we exported them and assumed someone else would do it, and they dealt with all the poorly sorted material that we chucked off to them. So I think any treaty does have to deal with the fact that, number one, we want to make less of the materials that can't be recycled. And then number two, make sure that wherever they're going have the capability to actually treat them and keep them out of the environment. I think that's a basic expectation, whether there's a treaty or not. I can tell you many, brands in some countries are already trying to deal with that outside of a treaty.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, do you envisage the treaty having a sort of financial element here? Do you envisage, poorer countries saying, hang on a second, if you want us to do this, there's got to be development support for the infrastructure?
I mean, it's difficult for me to say where the funding would come from in these different situations or scenarios that would play out. As I mentioned before, any recycling system we've looked at anywhere in the world costs more to operate than the materials that are collected are worth on the market. It's just a fundamental externality that needs to be dealt with. One of the reasons that I'm optimistic that we can make progress is we've seen a real sea change in the last few years about businesses in the consumer packaged goods sector, which is only 40 or 50% of all the plastics that are used, but consumer packaged goods companies saying we support producer responsibility legislation and regulations that would basically enable us to pay for recycling systems. And it's a small fee that's collected on every package. That fee goes toward supporting collection and recycling, whether it's your curbside recycling, deposit systems, or others. And EMF issued a statement, I think, last year that was signed by many companies. The Consumer Goods Forum's done the same, and we're seeing broad support now for funding mechanisms outside of the treaty that may become more formalized when we have a treaty down the road.
Yeah, one of the sources of optimism here, but also frustration, is there are policies that do seem to work, or certainly work better than what we have currently around the world. Kristen, I'll bring you in for one of the other questions here, and I think this is a really important one, actually. Somebody's written, they're anonymous, but they've written, paper's often seen as an alternative solution to plastic, and obviously we've also seen innovation in plastics, bioplastics, and other technologies, but that switch has a land use implication. Whether it's through the treaty or through sort of voluntary measures, there's a really important need here, isn't there, to consider unintended consequences. I mean, what can those working in this space do to minimise those risks? Deforestation being the most obvious one, but presumably there are others.
Well, again, I think that it's not just looking at this as taking a knee-jerk reaction. So as David said, I think it's really important that we take a holistic approach and look at the opportunities where we can reduce plastics that are simply not needed. And then sometimes those can be replaced with items like paper, and you hope that that paper is FSC certified, and you do try to ensure, and as we look at these recommendations, anything that where there is a substitution of material, certainly we want to hope that the outcome is also not more negative than what we're intending. And I think that there have been times when people immediately think, well, let's go back to utilizing glass rather than plastic, not understanding perhaps the GHG impact and other impacts that can come with utilizing glass or immediately just substituting one material for the other. So rather than just having a blanket approach to this, to saying completely let's ban plastic, at the Global Plastic Action Partnership, we're working at a very systemic change. So how do you reduce plastic and eliminate plastic that's unnecessary, whilst then looking for substitutes that can work, and looking at innovations where perhaps we can find new material design, materials that can be composted in your rubbish and don't have to be in industrialized composting and that sort of thing. And then also increasing the infrastructure, looking at ways that we can increase sorting, collecting, recycling, and also looking for opportunities to support those in the informal sector. So in order for us to really ramp up circular economy efforts, we absolutely need to be able to collect that plastic, and some of the most vulnerable people in that supply chain happen to be informal sector who are also known as waste pickers, and we're also trying to ensure that they are also not forgotten and left out in this process. So on one hand, let's look at the approach to new materials that are necessary. Let's not have a knee-jerk reaction in just substituting for something that might have a much more dire effect, but let's also look at that much more systemic change as we look to invest in the circular economy.
Absolutely. I think everyone wants to jump in on this one. I've seen hands jotting up from the whole panel. Both Christina and Carsten wanted to jump in on this and this is a critical part of the challenge, isn't it? I mean, I've been writing about this stuff for years, and I always, every time you write a story about an alternative, you always think, oh, in a few months' time, someone's going to explain why that has potentially negative consequences. I mean, glass being an obvious one there, it seems like a better alternative, but the embodied emissions can be higher. Carsten, sorry, you wanted to jump in, then Christina, I'll come to you also on this topic.
I do it quickly because I have construction works next door. So if I make too much noise, then someone else picks it up.
This is the world we all live in now. I think we'll all understand. But go ahead, Carsten.
Just to mark that it's on governments' minds. In the negotiations in Nairobi, they are discussing right now saying the scope of the plastic agreement should not be limited to plastics. It should look at the alternatives that we may want to consider. And from a circular economy point of view, it's pretty clear it wouldn't make sense to simply go substituting plastics to paper or any other material, which then doesn't fit into a circular system. The infrastructures we have discussed about in the systems, we wouldn't do that only to collect plastic packaging. We would also collect other types of packaging. So it's pretty clear plastics is the most visible outcome, what we see in the environment, because it stays there for centuries or maybe even longer. But the solutions must go beyond plastics, and life cycle thinking and creating circular systems for the various sectors and activities where plastics are being used, that should be the focus. Otherwise, we end up with very isolated, fragmented solutions to the plastic problem. And that's part of the challenge, to explain it to countries who want a quick fix. So if we're looking at countries like India saying we have an immediate problem with getting rid of certain problematic single-use plastic items, we don't need to wait for a treaty for that. They can advance on that agenda before that. But if we would limit international negotiations only to tackling that problem, we miss out on the opportunities to create the biggest systems that we need to have in place. And regarding the finance, I can only complement what David has also said. It will be not only about public funding. It will not only be about giving money just to every country to do whatever they want on plastics. It would be about how do we ensure dedicated, sufficient, and also effective funding for the solutions that we want. And the treaty could identify the priorities and the direction where the money should be spent. And that's part of the problem that we have today, that also private money goes into lots of different directions, which may not be as effectively spent as if there would be a commonly agreed vision what we want to achieve.
Absolutely. Christina, you wanted to come in as well on this issue of alternatives. I mean, it must be something that you have to look at very closely with your plans for phasing out certain plastics.
Absolutely, and I think it's like you said, both Christine and Carsten here, it's not only about plastic. So what we do, we use our circular design principles. So we need to look at every product, and actually we have assessed all our 9,500 products in our range to see how they are doing, to know what we need to move. And when you then design a product from the beginning, that's when you start to take the choice first, where do I put what material? And plastic you should only use where it makes sense to use plastic. And then you have to choose the right grade, etc., that it can also then in a later stage be both reused, refurbished, remanufactured, and only at the last stage, so to say, we talk about recyclability or to make it recycle. So that to make the right choice, and of course then you need to look at the differences in materials, about CO2, about availability, functionality, the cost, and also that you actually don't design a supply chain then with a material that you cannot scale. So that you have to have all those many perspectives, in your decision making all the time. So it is, you have to think about the different trade-offs, and maybe there are some decisions we have made previously, but now see maybe it wasn't the best when we now maybe know some more. So we have to work with this topic, I believe, all the time. And we work with Ellen MacArthur also in setting our design principles, I believe, and we even share those then now to the world sort of so publicly. So also maybe other companies who maybe doesn't have the size of ours can also use those assessments that we have found to be helpful at least, and then we can maybe together also improve them. So for sure, materials need to be chosen very very, very wisely in every step. And we need to then also develop tools, etc., for our people in our teams to be able to take those right decisions based on the data available today. And there, of course, we will get better all the time. And that's why I think also that this treaty can be good, because we will actually aggregate data much faster by doing this, so that we can get into fact-based decisions.
Yeah, getting that data, I think, is going to be one of these recurring themes of, I presume, next week's discussions as well as our discussions today. David, just before we get on to a few more questions, I was struck by something you said about how every time you've looked at this, you know, these schemes, recycling or improving recycling infrastructure, doesn't necessarily pay for itself. That there's, you know, it's hard to, you know, get a return on this without some kind of a presumably state backing all the way. Is that well, presumably it is a particular challenge here, because one of the things we found with the Paris Agreement is, even though Lord knows we're not making nearly enough progress on that front, we're seeing technologies that are now more cost competitive than the polluting alternatives, which means that the economics of it should start to flow over the next 2 decades. The challenge with the circular economy, it's always struck me, and what you said there sort of bears it out to a degree, is the business case seems much harder to make currently, to make this stuff play, to get the return. How can that be overcome? Because presumably until that's overcome, we've still got a pretty fundamental problem here.
Yeah, there are a few things that have to happen. Karsten mentioned at the beginning, and again, I'm speaking about plastic packaging in general, which started, you know, within the Ellen MacArthur Foundation as the New Plastics Economy Initiative, because plastic packaging was such a linear business model. With a few exceptions, many packages had never been designed to be recycled, and there were reasons that they were optimized to not be. It is incredibly cheap in most places in the world to landfill any type of waste. So when you look at that as the alternative, and from an economic standpoint, it's even less expensive to dump it in nature. You know, despite the costs downstream, that's the unfortunate reality for whoever's bearing the cost. So when we start looking at developing the infrastructures that are needed to do the reverse logistics of collection, of sorting, of reprocessing the material, they are more expensive than the status quo, the linear model that you know we have today from a purely economic standpoint. If we start looking at natural capital, I mean, circular economy makes a lot of sense, but unfortunately, right now, many people, you know, aren't bearing that cost in their pocket. So I think that's a big, you know, a big part of what we have to do is realize there are costs associated with extracting natural resources. There are costs associated with pollution or loss of those resources. And if we internalize those, that enables the circular economy solutions that we're talking about. The other thing that we did, again, working with EMF, is looking specifically at plastic packaging. I talked about those design considerations, is because of the design, the economics and the quality of recycling, in particular plastics, but some other materials aren't as good as they might be with metals or with paper or other things. And businesses, especially the leading companies, are now committing to design all of the packaging so that it fits into a circular economy, or that it will fit. That's how you see many of the big global brands and others have committed to making their packaging recyclable or reusable or compostable by 2025. Now, the infrastructure may not exist, but that's a key enabler that is also going to help with the economics of creating the circular economy.
Fascinating. So we always come back to, there is a big role for government here, isn't there? There does need that kind of intervention. Kristen, you had your hand up also.
I noticed Karsten also trying to put his hand up too, but I think I just beat you by a few seconds there. But no, I just wanted to build a little bit on what David was saying, because we recently, the Global Plastic Action Partnership, we recently published a financing toolkit that really built and showed a number of different opportunities. And actually, you do realize that right now, we absolutely need to rely on state financing and backing. We're looking at the development banks, we're looking at the JEF, but there are huge opportunities for us to take on board learnings from the renewable sector. And you mentioned the Paris Accord and how we need to shift there and the kinds of investments that were needed at one time. And yet all of a sudden we saw business models that showed a return on that investment. So whilst right now I think there's still a bit of a dearth in true practical investments in circularity, we're very hopeful by some of the case studies we've shown. Coca-Cola starting out with a CSR program in Mexico that turned into a big return on the investment, so is now a massive business case, a business opportunity for them in investing in that infrastructure and the recycling needs that then allow them to gain their RPET target. So there are, I think, huge opportunities. We're just not quite there yet. So we probably still need to shift and turn. And again, interesting conversation I had with a big bank here in London a few weeks ago, where we were talking about getting investments into the circular economy. And they said, we're not interested in circular, we're looking at infrastructure. And fascinating that those two aren't somehow also combined. And so I'm sure Kirsten could probably build on that, given EMF's approach to circularity. We're not talking just downstream, we also do need upstream solutions, but at the same time, how do we start to show practical investments that get that practical return in the waste management space as well?
Absolutely. Carsten, do you want to jump in as well? Do you agree that hopefully the time is coming when these become attractive investments?
Yes, I think we are trying to build the ground for that. I mean, we haven't mentioned that before the UNEA meeting next week, we have issued a pre-UNEA business statement where not only companies who are represented here today have signed up to, but also about 30 financial institutions. So the financial sector is already watching the space, both from a risk perspective, what plastic pollution could mean to negatively impact their investments, but also where do they want to make a positive contribution through their investments. And with advancing that discussions, where should circular investments go? How do we define them and how do we measure their impact? I think this will only grow, and there's a lot of attention also from the investor side on where the plastic journey would go.
Sorry, Carsten, just jump in there. I mean, that's a really important point, isn't it? Because one of the big upsides of the Paris Agreement was the signal it sent to markets, that it said these technologies are at risk of becoming stranded assets and these technologies are going to be really attractive. Presumably what you're trying to do here with this treaty is send that exact same signal to companies and investors to say, hang on, your business model is going to get pretty risky if you continue to be entirely reliant on polluting plastics, whereas if you adapt, it becomes more attractive. Presumably that's kind of stranded asset play is a big part of this.
This will also partly natural happening once there is an international negotiation process. I mean, so far as an insider community, you are following more closely the governmental agenda. Once that becomes more in the public domain, I think a lot of people will watch that space very carefully in which direction regulation will take in the future, and if there is a clear direction and alignment where it should go. I think that's the one side of it, but I see also from the public side, the OECD has published the Global Plastics Outlook this week, and they're planning to develop policy scenarios in different stages how we could get to a circular plastic scenario. And it's pretty clear that the entry points is de-incentivizing landfilling and incineration, but then there must be pathways. What do you do with the materials that you don't burn or landfill? And that's exactly what the treaty should develop, countries to support them in defining these solutions. Then we can go to the countries who already have extended producer responsibility schemes and differentiate far strongly the fees that industry have to pay, depending on what type of packaging they put on the market. And in the future, I'm with David, if we're making progress into incorporating all these externalities in our accounting systems, starting probably still with greenhouse gas emissions still, if we apply that to materials, suddenly, obviously, recycled plastics would have a far better assessment than virgin plastics, even if we move towards more renewable feedstocks in the future.
The market signals are coming, seems to be the message. Christina, you just wanted to jump in, but if you could very briefly, because I just want to rattle through some quick questions before we wrap up.
Yes, very briefly. I think that, what we will see is, of course, we need to have a new baseline that we compare towards. We cannot compare to the old economy when we actually go into the future. And I think also today we see that is less than 10% of the plastic is recycled. So of course, when that is going to be other figures, there will be economy of scale here, and business is used to kind of make things more efficient and more effective. And that will happen also here. And we see already today, of course, sometimes there's a premium to pay to get to the recycle, if you now talk about that part of the life cycle here. But we also see cost neutral. So that is where it's going to come. We have some progress with the ocean-bound plastic, for instance, where we can see that. So I think that here we need to do a little bit better. We need to explore. And when the business is going there, this will come with some power, and I think through such as this treaty it can go faster, and then also we see a new economy, and I think we are still comparing to the old economy. We need to move into the circular economy, all of us, and then it's a different baseline.
Yeah,
and then you want to be early into that journey.
Indeed, indeed. Excellent. We only got about 8 minutes or so, but we've got quite a few questions. So I'm going to try and rattle through as many of them as possible and ask people to keep their answers nice and concise. We've got a really interesting one from Sarah, which is a topic we haven't touched on at all. Could educating the public and media campaigns be embedded within a possible treaty as core components, or has trying to influence public opinion be found to be quite ineffective? Slightly provocative question there. David, what's your take?
Yeah, my take is where the infrastructure exists and the systems exist, then educating the public is absolutely appropriate. And there are great examples of where it is very effective at improving collection rates, reducing contamination, and improving overall systems. Asking people to recycle in areas that have really poor recycling infrastructure today, or where it's inconvenient, is going to be ineffective, and it makes us look like we're disconnected from the situation. So I think the answer is yes, it should be, but let's get the infrastructure there right. Then we can start helping people use it correctly.
Yeah, there's some wonderful history. I think Alice Bell had a book out recently. It's absolutely fascinating on the history of the climate crisis. And she did raise the point of some of the first sort of pick you up at your own litter campaigns were actually launched by companies that were trying to stop a crackdown on packaging waste, and they pushed the responsibility onto the individual and distracted from the need for regulation, and that was 50-60 years ago. So you're right, there needs to be the infrastructure if you're going to invite people to behave in better ways. So again, so many questions here. Kristen, I'll come to you with this one. How can the treaty ensure that circularity is maximised? And offers the interesting example of fashion companies that use the food grade recycled plastic, which has been flagged by an issue of several FMCGs. I mean, again, even if you get people to do things circular, it's not that simple, is it, from the off?
No, it's not simple at all. And actually, I think when you talk about the fashion industry, and a lot of people are very pleased that they've utilized, let's say, plastic bottles to turn into another material. Well, that material might now not be recyclable or even reusable. And so we have to be really thoughtful about the long-term effects of turning one item into another. And I think our bottle users, our Coca-Colas, our Pepsis, our Nestle's would say, right now we've got a huge opportunity to actually use bottles and turn bottles back into bottles at a very high rate. But there are other plastics that we actually now need to try to repurpose and reuse and recycle. So let's also look at new business models that move away from single-use plastic and look at refill models and reuse. Ellen MacArthur have an amazing report on reuse and really promote the opportunities there. And so I would really look at this. So I think we can create scale through circularity. I think we just need to really be thoughtful about what that means. And again, it's fascinating that this person also mentioned the fashion, because there's a lot of single-use plastic woven into fashion, and we're not even talking about that, and that means that these garments cannot be repurposed, and they do end up on the seabed, as David mentioned earlier, and yet there's very little that we can do with those. So I do think that there's a much deeper need for us to explore here as we carry on with these discussions in the treaty, and it's not super simple, but we are trying to get at some of the solutions.
Yeah, you mentioned sort of reuse, and actually there's Starbucks have just launched a new reusable cup campaign just today, and also you touched upon fashion. I mean, we've barely touched upon resource efficiency and how critical that is to the circular economy. Is there a big challenge here with any sort of treaty that you're going up against? You boil it down to maybe people should be buying less stuff, which is a very, very difficult argument to land with modern consumer economies. I mean, is that the third rail that no one wants to touch? Carsten, you can come in on that.
Yeah, maybe I'm the less suspicious if I put it out. I mean, we are also hesitating with, this is not the first message we are having, but in the engagement, the businesses that are cooperating with us on developing new circular business models, we are getting to that point. It's about, for the companies in the first place, to create revenues without producing more stuff. That's the whole equation which we are looking at for. So yes, recycling is part of the picture, but at the inner circles, it's about value retention, the stuff that we have produced once and put out of the market. How do we maximize the value for the user, the individual one or several ones at the same time or one after the other? And that's an education purpose, which hopefully we will advance when the treaty discussions are going on, that circular economy is more than just recycling materials.
Absolutely. Christina, you're nodding along there. I mean, it's such a big philosophical question, isn't it, as to whether a sort of a business in a capitalist society should aspire to sell less stuff. But I mean, how do you square that circle? And IKEA does have these ambitions. You've got big ambitions to become more of a service-based business.
We do, and we are also trying, you know, concepts of leasing your furniture. We are now also trying with the repair and care kits, so we can actually take care of your furniture, spare parts, so you don't need to buy new furniture. You can only exchange what is needed in the sofa, for instance. Maybe this armrest that goes, you know, okay, just replace that. So that there are those ways, and consumers also want that, but they want it to be easy. They want to know what they actually can do, and also to see how can we work in the communities around our retail outlets to see what can we do there. So I think that there's a lot of work to be done also in the service part, that is not necessarily about consuming new products. I mean, at the here anyhow, our business idea is of course to create better everyday life for the many people, and there are many that doesn't have anything today. Maybe that's where we then can focus more than just selling more to those who have everything. I mean, I think we need to also look into, of course, how we consume, and we can have alternatives. So we can offer both, and consumers can make a choice.
Absolutely. Apologies to the people whose questions we weren't able to get through. We are running out of time. I just want to go around the panel one last time, very quickly, and ask you to get your crystal balls polished for next week. What do you think happens from here? What are the prospects or the chances of advancing a treaty, given, you know, that there's significant support? I think Carsten said over 100 countries have signalled their support for this idea. It is advancing, and yet some very important holdouts, some key powerful players that seem less enamoured currently. What do you think is most likely to happen next week? And also, what's the signal for business, even if maybe you don't get a treaty within the coming months? Presumably there is still an important signal here for business about the direction of travel that we're seeing. David, I'll come to you first.
I guess I'm optimistic that we will have a positive outcome from this discussion, and of course then the work begins on what is the treaty, and then how do we enforce it. So I think this first step is very possible, and I hope it's an eye-opener for the businesses who are not part of the leading group today, to see that this is it's a new trend. It's a new way of thinking. It's a transition that hopefully more and more companies get on board.
Yeah, absolutely. Kristin, same question to you. What are you expecting?
Yeah, I also want to be optimistic, and again, I would say the same thing, that this is just the beginning. So even if a treaty is tabled and we move forward, then we still need to start talking about what goes into it, and what do we mean by certain targets, and how do we keep it enforceable and that sort of thing. But we're really looking forward to working with governments and companies in this journey to address plastic waste and pollution through the delivery of a meaningful treaty.
And Carsten, what are your sources telling you? Do you feel the opportunities there for next?
The opportunity is definitely there. Let me first say, if the outcome is we're creating just another international platform to exchange on best practices for plastics, that's a no result. We have lots of them. No need to add another one. So the direction must be we work towards a legally binding framework. And I think there's far more than 100, probably already up to 180 who are willing to go down that line. What we don't get next week is the agreement. I have to manage expectations. We get the decision to start negotiations on the agreement. So it's really the beginning of the journey. Paris was the end of the journey where we presented a new climate agreement that we will hopefully manage within 2-3 years, which would be exceptionally quick.
But if you get the agreement to start an agreement, if you will, that is a big investment signal to decision makers to say, hang on, this kind of stuff's coming. You are going to see more plastic taxes. You're going to see more extended responsibility. You're going to see more bans of single-use plastic. All that trend that we're already seeing presumably starts to go faster.
It should be an unstoppable moment to work towards a more circular world for plastics. That's it.
And
no more than less.
And Christina, I'm going to our same question to you, but also maybe your longer term crystal ball. I mean, do you envisage a world where this circular economy happens, that we're not wasting stuff, that the plastic, if we're using plastic at all, it is with absolutely negligible environmental impacts?
I wish to be an optimist in this part, and I think that there is the power is in actually going and doing things, and we have to do things differently. And the circular economy is just something we together need to tackle. And I mean, this is the multi-stakeholder approach. And I think that the treaty that will now go up to suggestion next week, I think that the movement has already started. just us sitting here talking, people listening in. We are in more of these talks so that something is happening already. So we're not starting now. We have to continue where we are and do better, faster and more together. And I would say that yes, of course, the circular economy is something that we together need to do if we want to continue to have the life as we know it today.
Excellent. A nice, upbeat, optimistic point on which to end. Well, very much fingers crossed for next week's summit and the negotiations that will follow from there. Not much more to me to say except to point out what everyone's already said, that as with the Paris Agreement, this is about long-term investment and market signals. This is putting pressure on businesses that don't act and pointing to businesses that do, that there could be huge opportunities therein, and that this is the responsible and sensible path to be going down. And similarly, putting pressure on policymakers, because without a right policy framework, this stuff will never move nearly fast enough. But as David and others pointed out, you know, there are examples of best practice that are working significantly better than the standard. So there are people we can learn from to move this agenda forward, hopefully very rapidly, because speed is absolutely of the essence, as everyone who works in the climate space is too sadly well aware. Excellent. Well, I think that's it from me. All I'm going to do is finally say a huge thank you to Carsten, to Kristen, to Christina, and to David. And thank you to Chris and the team at H&K who organised and have hosted today. And thank you all for watching and for your questions. It really did help the hour absolutely fly by. In fact, over an hour. We're now running 5 minutes over, so I should probably shut up. Oh, I'm just going to actually, sorry, I forgot something. I'm going to put something in the chat. Hold on, here's our story on Business Green from earlier in the week about the OECD report that was mentioned on plastic waste. If you're not a subscriber, why on earth not? You can get a free trial and access that. And also we'll be running a story on the back of this webinar hopefully before the end of the week, certainly by Monday ahead of the summit itself. So if there was anything you missed or you want to just look back on reflections from today, you can do so on Business Green in the coming days. Excellent, that's it. Thanks all. Thanks for watching, and hopefully hopefully catch up with you again soon for our next webinar.
Thanks, James. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, James.